All right, manufacturing. A big problem that the Chinese had was they looked down on traders, merchants, as being somehow evil. Romans generally did not. Now, having grown up in the country myself, when I played high school football, we would sometimes get ridiculed as being country boys or farm boys, as if farm boys were inferior to city boys. The city boys were looked on as being brighter, and the farm boys as being less bright. It was just backwards from what the Chinese looked on farming as being the ultimate high occupation, and merchants as being a low class of people to be shunned. Now, Europeans were not always perfect in that regard. How many have ever read the story of Robin Hood? Most hands went up in other class also. Robbed the merchants to feed the poor, with the idea that he was helping society out by taking from the rich and giving to the poor. Now, I got something to tell you. He would have been better off for all of society if he wanted to go steal from someone, steal from the poor, and give to the rich. Because in the long run, giving to the rich would have made the rich richer, which in turn would have made the poor richer also. Impoverishing the rich is a surefire way to impoverish all of us. May sound backwards or drastic, but to me, Robin Hood was not a hero. He was a bad guy. Anyway, but Jesse James, you know, folklore, he would, remember that's not folklore, Jesse James is a real person. He would sometimes see a farmer that looked dirt poor and stop the farmer, talk to him a while, and he and his men would shell out some of their money that they'd gotten by stealing from banks and give to the poor farmer. Again, he might have been better off robbing what little poor farmer had and putting that money in the banks. All of society might have been better off for it. Not that I'm advocating that, but to me, they think that backwards. Anyway, the Chinese looked down on their merchants more so than Europeans did. And your book also says Chinese were less prone to travel. These people, as I already mentioned, traveled a lot and traveled hundreds of miles. A typical Chinese person, unless he joined the army, he would be born, grow up, marry, raise a family, and die without having ever gone more than 5 miles from the place of his birth. Now, in the Middle Ages, a lot of Europeans did the same thing. Now, of course, the persons who joined the army would take them oftentimes much farther than that. The Chinese did build a lot of canals that joined their rivers. I've already mentioned the Grand Canal was built to join the Yangtze River to the Yellow River. They built other canals. So in that way, they did encourage trade somewhat. The canal is great because one horse who's even old and half lame can pull tons of weight over a waterway that would take teams of well-fed and healthy horses to pull over land. Generally, merchants were viewed as parasites, and because they were such parasites, they were not allowed to seek office or hold public office. Now, this, I'm looking at page 148. There in that second middle paragraph on the left-hand side of page 148, textile manufacturing, water mills, and iron casting. This is something that's going to sound a whole lot like Europe in the mid-1700s, when Europe started its industrial revolution and started with textiles and water to turn their factory machinery, you might say. As water flowed along, it would turn a big wheel, and the wheel would grind their grain or operate their textile machinery. The Chinese were doing this hundreds of years before Europeans. And folk, I can't emphasize enough, the Chinese were, up until 1500, the most inventive, creative people on earth. Their work with iron eventually led to the development of steel. Their inventions should have propelled them to the top of humanity. They didn't. And there have been many, many books written as to why, what was wrong with China. We're going to talk more about this when we visit China in the next chapter. What was the difference between the Chinese mindset and the European mindset? The Chinese are believed to have developed the very large sailing vessel, and they developed the rudder and the movable sail. Now, how many, do anybody know, if the wind is blowing this way, and you want to go this way in a sailboat, how do you do it?
Keep leaning the sail back and forth in a zigzag.
Exactly, yeah. You start off, let's see, you zig one way. Now, you might start off zigzagging this way. You simply put the sail here to catch the wind as it's blowing and move. Then when you want to go this way, you move the sail to where it catches the wind this way, and you zigzag. Now, the Chinese developed a movable sail, developed the rudder, and they also learned how to take wood and bury the wood a few feet in the ground, teak, I believe, and make this wood really, really hard. And this enabled them to make really large ships. Rumor has it they built ships that were 450 foot long, something Europeans were never quite able to duplicate, except the Greeks are said to have done it one time. But the Chinese claim that they built ships 450 foot long. The only thing we have from them is a rudder, and a rudder is big enough that it probably was put on a 450 foot long ship. Otherwise, the ships have long ago ceased to exist, rotted away, probably in the ocean. But who knows? Maybe someday we'll find one to prove that it was done. Chinese are credited with starting the Silk Road. The Silk Road started in China and ended up in the Mediterranean world. Now, your book shows a map of the Silk Roads going this way and ending up in the Euphrates River. Now, folk, there were times when the Silk Road went south and went through northern India. And in fact, at one point, the Silk Road went through northern Arabia. And that's where Mohammed ran into it a little bit. The Silk Road would vary from generation to generation, depending on the political winds, how well they could protect themselves from outlaws and bandits. If bandits became too rough here, they'd move it to where the bandits would know where the Silk Road was. As far as we know, no Chinese merchant ever went all the way to the Mediterranean world, and no Mediterranean person ever went to China and came back to tell about it. What they do, they'd travel a few hundred miles with their wares, sell their wares to a middleman. This middleman would travel a few hundred more miles and sell their wares to middleman. By the time the wares got to the Mediterranean world, the price was really high, and only the aristocratic Roman women could afford a silk. And one Roman historian talked about these silk trees. They had no idea. I mean, the Chinese kept their secret, kept their way of making silk a secret. Suppose it was accidentally discovered by an emperor's wife who noticed a silkworm spinning something that she became fascinated with and had the silkworm spin more of it, then got other silkworms, and eventually was able to put together silk. But she kept a secret, and the secret stayed with China for many years. Eventually, other people discovered it, but some people believe that the silk grew on trees there in China. The Romans were aware the Chinese existed. The Chinese were aware the Romans existed, but each side thought the other side to be very strange. Silk and porcelains traveled on the Silk Road, but they traveled back the other way toward China was Roman gold. Also horses. The Chinese imported horses and a few other goods from the Roman world. And a lot of Roman coins with Caesar's image melted or molded on the coin are still to be found in China to this day. Europe was to do without gold for many generations until finally Europeans came to the New World and stole a bunch of gold from the western part of South America, and then Europeans were to have gold again. But for many years, Europe's economy was not based on money because there wasn't much of it. Social changes, one thing I remember, women continued to play a secondary role, and this was to go on throughout Chinese history. They kept their women subservient and inferior. And later on, we won't mention it now, but later on we'll talk about how the Chinese women would do a practice called foot binding. But that was to come later. Foot binding guaranteed that the women would be more subservient than ever. In the meantime, over here, the Roman men started out taking the lead. Then as time went on, the men lost their leadership. And you can decide for yourself. Personally, I think the results were disastrous. But again, to each his own. The Chinese began to pay more attention to the nuclear family as time went on, and less attention perhaps to the extended family, even though the extended family, that is, if you're descended from the same great-great-grandparents, was necessary in China because they needed teamwork larger than nuclear family. It's larger teamwork to grow rice crops. So they still had their extended family, but the nuclear family, that's the father and mother and the children in the family, became somewhat more important during this period of time. Religion, all right. The primary religion, as I already mentioned, was Confucius. In addition, like they had earlier, the persons who thought Confucianism was too materialistic would adopt Taoism because it was more spiritual. But Buddhism began to make inroads. Now, folk, some web pages I've read said that Christianity was introduced into China in 100 CE, or 70 years after Jesus left the earth. But Chinese tended to look down on any foreign religion, and they didn't adopt Buddhism primarily because it was a foreign religion, as was Christianity. It's believed that Buddhism made its way into China as a result of traders who crossed these mountains, went into China with their wares. At least that's what is suspected. And then a lot of Buddhist missionaries then would go into China to try to make converts. And eventually Buddhist monks would come back to India for more training. Sometimes they'd sail around Vietnam. I mean, this became a Buddhist center also. Now, I said Chinese did not like foreign religions. Sadly, though, come 1949, they embraced a foreign religion, namely communism. Communism is not a religion. Call it what you will. They embraced a foreign worldview. Personally, I think communism is a religion, but they embraced a foreign worldview, and even they are about ready to admit it did not help them. But communism was certainly not indigenous to inside of China. The Chinese had practiced painting and sculpture. Your book shows a picture of one of their sculptures. And one of the Chinese inventions was paper. And from paper, they made paper money. Your book shows a picture of a Chinese man making paper. You may know paper is made from wood. Well, after a while, the Han Dynasty declined. And folk, this is a kind of a sad part of the story. They got an emperor named Wang Mang, and no, I'm not going to write his name down. But anyway, this emperor was a reform-minded emperor who tried to eliminate the chaos, tried to help the poor. Well, what happened? He got assassinated. Now, folk, a lot of reformers down through the ages have been mistreated, and in my own lifetime, the Russians got a reform-minded premier named Gorbachev. In short order, he was disliked, mistreated, and kicked out. It almost seems like sometimes for certain kind of people, the best kind of rule they can have is a dictator who says, I'm boss around here and what I say goes, and I don't care about you. Hey, we got rid of Saddam Hussein, and guess what we have now? ISIS. Get rid of, hey, man, let me tell you something, folks. The Cubans got rid of Batista and got Fidel Castro. Wasn't it wonderful? The Russians got rid of the Tsar, and they got Lenin and Stalin. What a big change. Now, I can tell you a couple of them, this happens to a lot of young men. Young man decide, I don't like living in my papa's house. My mother tells me to clean up my room and clean out the sink. I want to go somewhere where nobody tells me what to do. Hey, I know what I'll do. I'll go join the Marines. You think the Marines are going to allow you to have a dirty sink? The Marines do not allow that. They make sure you wear a clean uniform and they inspect you. Well, his dad wound up looking, and these young men I'm thinking about, their father seemed like a mild-mannered, soft-spoken man compared to those Marine corporals. been wound up where she never joined. All right, now, one thing, they eventually, to make a long story short, the Han declined. Now, I'm about to finish. Your book compares Rome and China. Both of them were united for centuries. Both of them built elaborate systems of roads. Both of them built large cities. Both of them, for the family, stood at the head, with a male at the head for a time. Both of them had high taxes that eventually led to destruction. Both of them, the poor people lost their lands, and the poor people then were prone to riot. Very similar. Both of them experienced a population growth at first, followed by a population decline. Again, a lot in parallel, and both of them had problems with barbarians. As the climate cooled, the barbarians had to move. Now, one set of Oriental barbarians, the Huns, came all the way here because they were kicked out of Mongolia by their own fellow Mongolians. But the Mongolians began to move and began to pester the Chinese, and the Chinese were not strong enough to overcome them. The same with Europe. The difference was, all right, both societies collapsed. China collapsed for about 400 years. Europe collapsed for about 700 or 800 years. Europe never did reunite. China went through a period of chaos, which we'll talk about next time we visit China in a few weeks. But the Chinese recovered faster than the Europeans. Your book says there was less social mobility in China. In other words, in Europe, people had a better chance of moving up. All right, this word is going to be either on this test or the next. Nomadic people. Anybody know what do you mean by nomad? Wandering. Oftentimes they're herdsmen who wander from place, following the herds. Sometimes the herds are their own herds that they've tamed, like cattle and sheep. They'll graze their sheep for a while in the pasture land, then move on to the next pasture until this former pasture is grown back, because once sheep have grazed the land, no other animal can graze after they've grazed. That's why cattlemen and shepherds often don't like each other, because the sheep can really get down low, and a horse's lip and a cow's lips are too thick to get down as low as a sheep can. Some of you might know what I'm talking about. But anyway, some of the people just follow game herds, like elk or deer, just wherever the herds go, they have to go. Roaming tribal, generally tribal people who do not contribute a lot to civilization, but sometimes they contribute a lot to the destruction of civilization. Invasions by foreign peoples. Inevitably, both sides collapsed. Eventually, Rome lived on only as an idea. China was able to eventually reconvene itself. All right, folks, so much for that for now. Before anybody have any comments, questions, all right, have a good weekend. Monday might be a bad time to give a test, but it's convenient for me. So the test did get back from the print shop. So